Good afternoon and welcome to those of you who are just joining this webinar today on Aristotle on virtuous emotions and their education. This is the second webinar in the series Fostering Personal and Social Virtues in Education from the Jubilee Centre in collaboration with the Congregation for Catholic Education in Rome. You are most welcome to join us this afternoon with our speakers, Professor Kristján Kristjánsson, Dr. Liz Gulliford and Dan Wright. We will get going in just about a minute and a half's time, just letting people join. We would ask you to please keep your microphones and cameras off for the duration of the webinar. If you would like to ask a question to any of our speakers, please do post that in the chat and we will spend about 30 minutes. We've got 90 minutes for this webinar, the final 30 of which will be a question and answer discussion. But please post your questions in the chat at any point during the talks this afternoon. My name is Aidan Thompson. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Jubilee Centre and I will chair today's proceedings. And we will begin very shortly introducing our speakers. But you're most welcome. Please settle in and we will get going shortly. I should say that today's session is being recorded and will be posted online on the Jubilee Centre website, hopefully as soon as tomorrow morning, so that you can access it and rewatch it. To those of you who are joining this via the recording in the future, then you're very welcome and thank you for watching along. This is the second webinar in the series Fostering Personal and Social Virtues in Education. The third, fourth and fifth webinars, which will be on the 14th of September, 12th of October and 9th of November, details of which are on your screen at the moment and are also on the Jubilee Centre's website. Okay, and we will make a start. You are very welcome to join us this afternoon for today's webinar, Aristotle on Virtuous Emotions and Their Education, as part of the Fostering Personal and Social Virtues in Education webinar series, hosted by the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues in collaboration with the Congregation for Catholic Education in Rome. Today's speakers are Professor Kristján Kristjánsson at the University of Birmingham, Dr. Liz Gulliford at Northampton University, and Dan Wright at the London Oratory School. The way in which today's webinar will operate is that I will now introduce the first two speakers, Kristján and Liz, who will speak for about 20 minutes each on Aristotle and virtuous emotions. I will then hand over to Dan to give a 10-minute response as the discussant, and then hand over for the question and answer session. If you have any questions at any point for any of our speakers, please do post them in the chat. If you could identify if your question is for a particular speaker, please do say that in the chat when you post the question. If your question is to all speakers, then also please could you indicate that. My name is Aidan Thompson. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Jubilee Centre, and I will be chairing today's webinar. So, introducing our speakers. First of all, Professor Kristján Kristjánsson is Professor of Character Education and Virtue Ethics, and he is one of the two Deputy Directors at the Jubilee Centre at the University of Birmingham. Kristján has written extensively on moral education, educational psychology, moral philosophy, political philosophy, and he sees himself as a bridge builder between philosophy and social science. Kristján is the author of many books, but most recently on Aristotelian character education, published by Routledge in 2015, Virtuous Emotions from Oxford University Press in 2018, and Flourishing as the Aim of Education by Routledge in 2020. Aristotelian Character Education was the winner of the Society for Educational Studies Best Education Book in 2016. And his 2012 book, 2012 has appeared in a Korean translation, and other books have also been translated into other languages, including Japanese and Chinese. Our second speaker is Dr. Liz Gulliford of the Northampton University. Liz has a long-standing interest in research on human strengths, and her conceptual and empirical work has been published across a range of academic disciplines, including psychology, philosophy, and education. Liz studied her doctoral thesis, an interdisciplinary evaluation of positive psychological approaches to strengths and virtues at Queen's College, Cambridge. Liz is interested in all aspects of positive psychology, well-being, and is particularly interested in the topics of gratitude, forgiveness, hope, optimism, courage, humility, and compassion. The reason for introducing both speakers at the beginning is that the two speeches will run into one another, that Christian will speak first and go straight into Liz's second speech. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Kristján Kristjánsson.
Thanks a lot, Aidan. I'll just share my screen now. I hope you can all see my screen, right? Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here, dear colleagues and friends. So on behalf of myself and my co-presenter Liz Gulliford, I welcome you all to this presentation. I know there is a varied group of people in the audience comprising of academics and practitioners, and it's not always easy to satisfy the different expectations of these two groups. But we will try to say something that will be informative for both groups. More depth about my part can be gained by reading my 2018 book, Virtuous Emotions, and actually the painting you see in the upper right-hand corner, Patience on a Monument Smiling at Grief, representing two emotions, is by the English painter Spencer Stanhope, and it's from the cover of the book. So why this sudden interest in the last 30 to 40 years in emotions, in philosophy, psychology, and education? I will mention four motivations. One is the revival of virtue ethics in philosophy, and what draws many people, not least women like Hursthouse and Nussbaum, to Aristotelian virtue ethics is precisely the focus on virtuous emotions and their role in the good life. The second motivation is the cognitive turn in general psychology, especially in the study of emotions, which also signals a return to the cognitivist Aristotle. The third reason is the fall of a rationalist, especially Kohlbergian paradigm in moral psychology. So perhaps emotions rather than pure reasoning bridges the gap to moral action, the famous Kohlbergian gap between knowing the right and doing the right. And finally, there is a so-called affective shift in moral education, where the tide has turned from seeing emotions as interlopers in the realm of reason and intruders in classrooms towards acknowledging their role in the well-being of students, be that well-being understood in psychological terms, moral terms, or pure educational terms. We can also mention here the rise of emotional intelligence or social emotional learning, of positive psychology, and character education with a strong emotional focus. So what did Aristotle take emotions to be then? Well, he undeniably had a cognitivist and a componential theory of emotions, but did he consider the cognitive component of emotions to be a judgment or a perception? That is unclear. Quote, "The emotions are those things through which, by undergoing change, people come to differ in their judgments and are accompanied by pain and pleasure," unquote, he says. A specification which seems, initially at least, to place him in the judgmentalist rather than the perceptualist camp. However, when it comes to characterizing individual emotions, he typically avoids the term judgment and relies rather on the verb to appear, or the noun appearance. It seems then that to experience, say, compassion, one does not necessarily need to judge another person to have suffered undeserved misfortune, but only perceive or see such misfortune as having happened. Now, I wonder why Aristotle did not make a distinction which he could have made along the lines of his famous model of the four causes of all things, between the efficient cause, which we could call the source of an emotion, and its formal cause latching onto its formal object. It would seem agreeably Aristotelian to hold that the source, namely as Aristotle's efficient cause, of an episode of a student's jealousy, for example, would be the perception of a teacher attending more carefully to a fellow pupil than to me, if I'm the student. Something appears to me, given who, what, and where I am, as a relative disfavoring of me by the teacher. This perception then causes an evaluative thought about undeserved differential treatment, a thought that draws the mind to the formal cause, namely the formal object of the emotion of jealousy, which is undeserved differential treatment. And then this would be accompanied by the final cause of the emotion, its goal-directed activity, showing jealousy, doing something about your jealousy, along with the material cause, which is what you feel, the pain in your body. So this would account for what an emotion is by drawing on all the four Aristotelian causes. Perception, the efficient cause, elicits evaluative thought, the formal cause, which is accompanied with a sensation as the material cause, and all this leads to action or reaction, the final cause. Namely, the student expresses her jealousy in some way to achieve some goal. So what stands out there is that there are emotion theorists nowadays who equate emotion with each of the four causes individually. So people like Jesse Prince say that emotions are just perceptions. Nussbaum, drawing on the Stoics, says that emotions are just cognitions. The feeling theorists, drawing on William James, say that emotions are just sensations. And then finally, there are still some behaviorists who say that emotions are just behaviors. But on this reconstructed Aristotelian picture, at least, an emotion is not one, but all four of those things collectively. So let us now turn from ontology to ethics, the moral or virtue side of emotions, which I suppose most of you listening to this will be more interested in. So emotional dispositions can, Aristotle says, no less than action dispositions, have an intermediate and best condition proper to virtue. When emotions are felt, as he says, at the right times, about the right things, towards the right people, for the right end, and in the right way. If the relevant emotion is too intense or too slack for its object, we are badly off in relation to it, but if it's intermediate, follows the golden mean, we are well off. And the person can be fully virtuous only if they are regularly disposed to experience emotions in this medial way. And the mediality, I mean the golden mean as it's often called, in the sense of being neither too intense nor too slack, too wide or too narrow, refers to various variables, such as occasions, objects, people, motive, goal, and way or degree. The bottom line is that Aristotle's famous theory of the golden mean applies to emotions as dispositions or traits no less than to action traits. And because of the number of different parameters there, you can get an emotion wrong in various ways. I mean, Howard Cursor has counted at least 40 ways in which you can get each emotion wrong, but there's only one way in which you hit the golden mean of all these variables and get it right. So proper medial anger, for example, is the golden mean between being too mild and too forgiving, too mild and forgiving versus being too easily and excessively angry. There is a slight complication here, however, namely that specific episodic emotions do not constitute virtues any more than individual actions do. Rather, virtues are settled character states or hexes. We are praised or blamed for our virtues and vices, but we do not blame the people who is simply angry. Overcome with anger, certainly, Aristotle says. The underlying idea is that we cannot control the experience of episodic emotions once the relevant emotional disposition to experience them is in place. But dispositional emotions cannot be full-blown virtues either, but rather just traits that are characteristic of good people. They are components of virtues, and actually says that all but 3 of the moral virtues do have an emotional component. There are 3 which he excludes, which have just to do with politeness in social encounters. But anyway, this complication is a bit tortuous, this complication that emotions are not really virtues in and by themselves. So Aristotle cannot categorize compassion, for example, as a full-blown virtue. It's just the emotional component of a wider moral virtue or virtues, which include doing something with the compassion rather than just feeling it. So the virtue would have to have some other name, like kindness or whatever. In any case, emotions are part of virtues, which in turn are a part of good character, which is a core ingredient in living well. So when one looks at the emotions that Aristotle describes, they fall broadly into 3 categories with respect to their targets. Emotions directed at oneself, like pride, at other people, like compassion, or at external events, like fear. Now, notably missing from this list are any emotions directed at ideals or idealizations, such as beauty, truth, and goodness in the abstract. There is no awe in Aristotle, either inspired by a heightened sense of beauty in art or nature, the mystic immensity of the universe, or the unconditional goodness of an act of self-sacrifice. The reason for this omission is that Aristotle was not inclined to seek the meaning and end of life outside it, as Plato did, and correspondingly did not think that detachment from appreciating contingent things and from associated emotions is what philosophy should teach people as being part of their eudaimonia. And actually in a later book, my recent book on flourishing, I consider this to be one of the weaknesses of Aristotle's theory of flourishing. It's very disenchanted. Now let us turn more practical, walking the walk. So the purpose of moral inquiry is not to know what virtue is, but to become good, Aristotle says, since otherwise this inquiry would not be of any benefit to us. These are very famous words. So let's stop the abstract theorizing, let's say something practical. Now, in Aristotelianism, virtue education is not an addition to an understanding of morality or the study of moral philosophy. It is rather what such understanding and study are all about. As possessing virtues is what matters most for eudaimonia or flourishing, and good education is meant to contribute to eudaimonia, studying the virtues will be an integral part of any good education. It also means that emotional traits are to be justified morally as intrinsically important for the good life as a whole, not only as instrumentally important for some aspects of the moral life, even less so as just instrumentally important for non-moral aims, such as great attainment. Let's now turn to the nature of good character. Good character is made up of virtues, as we all know, according to Aristotle, and a virtue is the sort of active disposition which makes a person act or react in a golden mean, in situations involving choice, following reason, as the person of practical wisdom does in matters concerning emotions and actions. Notice, in matters concerning not only actions, but also emotions. So character education, according to Aristotle, is understood predominantly, therefore, in the early stages at least, to involve emotional sensitization. So what Aristotle calls habituation is more than anything else emotional conditioning, ideally accompanied with reasons and justifications, into the right emotional mindsets. Hence, for moral educators, especially at the early stages of the school system, I mean, primary, elementary school, in particular, even kindergarten, preschool, the biggest question is, how are virtuous emotional dispositions best cultivated? And here we have to turn empirical. So what I did when I wrote my book in 2018 was that I looked at some of the most common paradigms of emotional education alongside the Aristotelian one in order to compare and contrast those with Aristotle. So I ended up with 7 main paradigms, and I analyzed them according to 4 criteria. So I looked at 4 criteria and how those are reflected in these 7 different paradigms. I looked at what they say about the valence of emotions to be cultivated. Are they supposed to be only positive or also negative or mixed? I looked at the epistemology of value, whether it's rationalist or sentimentalist. And I can say more about these terms later if in the Q&A if you want me to go into that in detail. I mean, the difference between hard and soft rationalism and hard and soft sentimentalism. And by the way, Aristotle's theory is soft rationalism, according to this taxonomy. I also looked at what they say about the general aims of emotion education. Is it moral or non-moral, intrinsically or instrumentally valuable? And I also looked at what they say about how emotions are related to self or selfhood. So what kind of understanding of self is assumed or presupposed in these paradigms? Is it a realist self or only sort of an anti-realist identity or self-concept? So what I ended up with was these 7 different paradigms of emotional education: Aristotelian, care ethics, social emotional learning, positive psychology, the so-called emotional regulation discourse, the so-called academic emotion discourse, and social intuitionism. And I won't go into all these details here. I mean, you can look at this in my book if you're interested, but it just shows you how it's possible to sort of categorize these 7 paradigms according to these 4 variables that I mentioned. And obviously the focus today is on the Aristotelian paradigm. So just to give you an indication of how Aristotle would fit into this, I mean, he's interested in both positively and negatively felt emotions. And interestingly, actually, Aristotle thinks that most, if not all, emotions have got mixed valence. He doesn't really believe that any emotion is just pleasant or just painful. He thinks they sort of, most of them or all of them include a mixture of elements, although some are more pleasant, some are less pleasant, etc. His epistemology of value is soft rationalism, and again, I can explain this in more detail if you're interested later. The general aim of emotion education is to cultivate moral and intrinsically valuable emotions. That's the main Aristotelian goal, rather than just emotions which are extrinsically or instrumentally valuable for, let's say, great attainment or job success. And when he talks about emotions in relation to self or character, he's talking mainly about a realist self. And he's talking about understanding who we are really deep down and learning to respect ourselves. But interestingly, he also talks about identity or self-concept, which is sort of a very, very modern way of speaking, centuries ahead of his time, actually. This is long before, obviously, Rousseau, and not to mention the sort of the theories of identity in the 20th and 21st centuries. So he says that actually, to use sort of a metaphor, we don't only need to get the furniture in the mind right, we also need to get the mirror reflecting this furniture right, and the mirror of the reflecting the furniture is our identity or self-concept, where we look at ourselves who we really are. So when it comes to explaining the methods by which virtuous emotions are best cultivated, Aristotle becomes very quiet, however. He only mentions explicitly the educational value of music at the habituation stage, but we have no clear indication of what strategies work best at the phronesis developmental stage, although he mentions some of those in passing. So I also conducted a discourse analysis looking at the main educational strategies that the 7 paradigms of emotion education suggest, and I came up with 7 categories of those. It's perhaps easiest to explain to what extent Aristotle mentions them. Interestingly, he makes some reference to at least 6 of those strategies. So he was clearly a methodological pluralist in the field of emotion education. He recommended various different strategies. So the only one of the sort of the 7 which are most discussed in modernity, which it doesn't really talk about as an educational strategy, is behavioral conditioning, because he would just call it conditioning, not really education. But he talks about learning to reframe our emotions, for example, by finding alternatives in stories or poetry, alternatives to how we would interpret things. He talks about nudging or modification of our environment in the politics. He talks about habituation a lot in the Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about direct teaching in terms of learning what phronesis is. Again, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about role modeling a lot, learning to model your emotions on moral exemplars in the rhetoric. And then, as I said, in the politics, he spends a long time talking about the value of music in regulating our emotions. And then on this slide, I indicate the extent to which the 7 different paradigms of emotion avail themselves of these 7 different strategies. And some of this is fairly speculative, as the methods are often just hinted at, not spelled out in full, but I'm happy to revisit this in the Q&A later. So you can see that a lot of these different paradigms of emotion education do avail themselves of the same strategies, but they do it for actually often for different reasons. Now, someone might say this overview of Aristotle's emotion theory has been historically interesting and philosophically illuminating, but exactly what is its practical relevance today for the psychology and education of emotions? I think there are various lessons to be learned, both for contemporary academics studying emotions and educators cultivating them in students. For example, according to Aristotle, for at least some emotions, the initial focus must be on identifying their cognitive components. What is this emotion really about? What's the formal structure? Evaluations of emotions must be multi-componential. They must track their various components. Thirdly, studies of the cognitions must respect the views of both the many and the wise. Not only look at what the philosophers say, but also what the people in the street say about emotions. And finally, emotion education must target mediality, or the golden mean, because even the best of emotions can have excess forms. You can feel too much of them. And there is nobody better qualified than Dr. Liz Gulliford to exemplify how those lessons can be and have been made use of in studies of our standard emotions. So over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Kristján. Thank you also to Aidan for the kind introduction as well. I'm just going to find my slides and hopefully pick up from the current slide. So you should be able to see those now on the screen. Can I have a thumbs up from people, please, on that? Okay, thanks. So it won't come as a surprise to anyone familiar with my research that I've chosen to apply Aristotle's ideas in psychology and education to gratitude. As many of you will know, Aristotle did not himself consider gratitude to be a virtue of the megalopsychoi, the paragons of virtue in the Nicomachean Ethics. So at first blush, this may seem to be rather an odd choice. That said, it's possible to examine and apply Aristotle's general approach to any emotion or enduring disposition. So from 2012 to 2015, I was research fellow on the Jubilee Centre's Attitude for Gratitude project with Blair and Kristján, which did just this. In what follows, I will show you how we applied an Aristotelian approach to our interdisciplinary examination of gratitude. So the Attitude for Gratitude project examined a number of specific questions with recourse to a wide range of methodologies, as I will demonstrate. These were: what is gratitude? When and why is gratitude experienced? What value do the British public place on gratitude? What are British people grateful for? And to whom are they grateful? What kinds of people tend to be grateful? And do the British public believe gratitude can be promoted across a range of contexts? And if so, how might this be achieved? So time obviously won't permit me to share all of our findings today, though that report is available for download from the Jubilee Centre website. However, I will focus on the findings today that exemplify the Aristotelian approach to educating virtuous emotions as befits today's talk. But there's obviously a lot more in that report, which got its 15 minutes of fame in June 2013 when we were invited to talk about our research on the local BBC News. So we can see how an Aristotelian approach to gratitude breaks gratitude down into components that Kristján was talking about. Gratitude has cognitive components, and as I'll show in more detail, we place cognitive conditions on when gratitude might or might not be deemed appropriate. And gratitude also has affective, that's to say emotional components, behavioural components, and cognitive components. In addition to appraising when gratitude might be appropriate, gratitude requires an accompanying feeling, that emotional aspect, to be authentically realised. Moreover, to be truly grateful requires something of us behaviourally, for example, saying thank you or reciprocation. And to echo Kristján's earlier remarks, gratitude is a multi-component concept. In our treatment of gratitude, we endorse the Aristotelian recommendation to consult the views of the many and of the wise. And finally, in this worked example of applying an Aristotelian approach, our treatment recognised that gratitude needs to be discriminate or discerning, and to some extent proportionate, recognising this Aristotelian notion of mediality, which Kristján's already mentioned. First of all, let's consider the cognitive appraisals involved in gratitude. So gratitude is a highly cognised emotion. When we make a grateful attribution, we likely consider the following conceptual conditions, usually implicitly, though possibly explicitly too. So was the person who benefited us doing their job, or did they go beyond duty to benefit us? And this is what we would call the supererogation condition in our 2013 paper, which you can see a section of there. Did the person who conferred the benefit have genuinely benevolent intentions, or might they have been looking for a return favour down the line? Of course, on that note, we can only ever guess at the motives of others. We can't actually know for sure, but we can intuit those. Thirdly, how much effort did the benefactor expend in rendering the benefit? And we might also build in these considerations of value, how valuable the benefit is, and also whether the intention to benefit us was fully realised. So we've got these conceptual conditions which we discussed in that paper, which a couple of months ago was translated into German. So there are different ways of looking at these conditions. Some people might want to assign them the status of being necessary conditions of gratitude. For instance, gratitude requires that a benefactor acts in a supererogatory fashion to benefit us, goes beyond duty. On the other hand, people could construe these conditions as filters or amplifiers of gratitude, what one might call, using a photographic analogy, the gratitude aperture. And in the case of supererogation, Roberts deemed supererogation a necessary condition of gratitude, whereas Terry McConnell didn't believe that going above and beyond duty was a requirement for gratitude to be warranted. Now hold those in your mind just for a moment, the supererogation condition, because I am going to come back to this. So most philosophers are of the view that gratitude requires benevolent intentions. However, the Buddhist philosopher, the late Buddhist philosopher, Patrick William Fitzgerald, made the provocative suggestion that benevolent intention is not a requirement. Indeed, there are special cases where one might even be grateful for things that were motivated by malicious intentions. Now, few people, I think, would contest that putting more effort into a benefit should make us more grateful, though we are often grateful for small things. Indeed, it's perhaps a good idea to cultivate that habit. Psychologists Tessa, Gatewood and Driver tested out the differential effects of cost and value of a benefit. while people may be more grateful for more valuable things, we're often grateful for gifts that aren't especially valuable. Of course, that may depend on the individual as well. And of course, we're also grateful for intended benefits that didn't materialize. It's a thought that counts, a nomination for award that was ultimately won by someone else. So these act as filters and amplifiers of gratitude, creating this gratitude aperture that could be kind of broad, or it could be rather more narrow. Now, it seems quite likely and empirically testable, this is the key thing, that people's views about these various conditions placed on gratitude will differ and change. For example, as cognitive capacities become more developed, we would expect young people's thinking about when gratitude is warranted to become more sophisticated. Also, there could be cultural differences in these gratitude appraisals, and people's views on these necessary and sufficient conditions of gratitude could be subject to empirical disconfirmation, as we will soon see. Now, given that there are multiple components involved in gratitude alongside the cognitive, measures of gratitude should aim to incorporate as many components as they can. And many popular measures tend to operationalize gratitude reductively as simply grateful feeling. But there's something amiss if we don't know much, indeed, if we don't know anything about the underlying cognitive conditions that people might place on gratitude, and whether they engage in behaviours that demonstrate putatively authentic feelings of gratitude as well. Now, without this behavioural component, gratitude is arguably indistinguishable from the feeling of appreciation, as Navarro and Tudge contend in a 2020 paper. So in order to tap the multiple dimensions of gratitude, my former colleagues and I created the multi-component gratitude measure, Morgan, Gulliford and Christensen 2017, which assesses the underlying concept of gratitude an individual holds, the degree of grateful feeling they experience, their attitude towards gratitude, and self-reported behaviours associated with gratitude. Now, obviously, a caveat here is that we can't know for sure that these behaviours are enacted, but it does take us a step closer to measuring gratitude-related behaviours. So you can see on there a few examples from the measure of how we tapped those different aspects of gratitude. So who has the right to define concepts? Should it be the wise, experts like philosophers, psychologists, educationalists, or should the voices of the many ordinary language users carry the day, or can it be both? So in the Attitude for Gratitude project, we foregrounded the importance of assessing lay understanding of gratitude alongside analysis of experts by using three methodologies: prototype analysis of gratitude, a vignette questionnaire for participants 11 years and up, which taps lay people's conceptual understanding of gratitude, and I'll show you how it does that, and gratitude stories for younger participants aged around 8 to 11. So let's just take a moment for everybody to think what words they associate with gratitude. Don't overthink this, just what comes into your mind when somebody says gratitude. So the first step of a prototype analysis calls for people to list the words and features they associate with a given concept, building a kind of bottom-up analysis of the defining features of a concept, obviously gratitude in this case. In our study, we also asked people to rate the valence of the features that they came up with, where 1 is very negative and 5 is very positive. Now, time really doesn't permit me to go into detail here about the various stages of a prototype analysis. I would just say read our paper, but the process involves 3 stages. So after initial collection of frequencies of features of gratitude in study 1, the centrality of these features to the concept, in this case gratitude, is rated by a second set of participants, and then a third study tests the hypothesis that the feature centrality influences cognition of gratitude. For example, more central features are more likely to be recalled than less central features, and this would corroborate a prototypical structure. Now, all of that's rather technical. What I want the take home to be is this. We found a greater incidence of negatively rated features, obligation, indebtedness, guilt, embarrassment and awkwardness in the UK than an earlier US prototype study had found, suggestive perhaps of cultural differences in people's understanding of gratitude. And we also found a significant positive correlation between gratitude and virtue in study 3. In other words, lay people construe gratitude as a virtue. So alongside this prototype analysis, we also designed a vignette questionnaire to operationalize those conceptual conditions placed on gratitude, which we outlined earlier: supererogation, effort, cost, value, etc. Now, these conditions underlie people's appraisals of gratitude. You can see how we did this in the excerpt that you see there on the slide. We asked a kind of baseline question to elicit gratitude, which we followed up with various manipulations, which each operationalized a different conceptual condition. So at baseline, participants were presented with a statement: a colleague nominates you for an award at work. If you win, you'll receive recognition of your hard work and a voucher. We then asked participants 3 questions to gauge their level of reported gratitude. The first question called for participants to rate their level of agreement with that statement: you are grateful to the colleague who nominated you, on a 5-point scale. We then asked participants to indicate the degree of gratitude they would feel by placing a vertical line on that horizontal line corresponding to the amount of gratitude they would feel, from the extreme left to the extreme right. And finally, we asked participants to respond to the normative statement: you should be grateful to the colleague who nominated you, also on this 5-point scale. Now, as you can see there, the example we've got here operationalizes an ulterior motive. The colleague has nominated you because she wants you to repay the favor by helping her with her own workload. So using a series of manipulations like this one to the original sort of baseline scenario, we were able to assess the degree to which gratitude appraisals are impacted by a benefactor's effort. They put a lot of effort into the nomination, their motivation, perhaps there was an ulterior motive, and so on and so forth. Now, by finding a way of testing these conceptual conditions placed on gratitude empirically, using that questionnaire, we were able to test the intuitions of the wise about gratitude against the assessments of the many. Now, in a different vignette questionnaire describing a rescue scenario, we were able to show that most people tend not to insist that gratitude requires individuals to go above and beyond duty to benefit another person, that supererogation condition I was talking about earlier on. Lay people deem gratitude warranted even when they benefit us through discharging their duties. So only 1.5% of that large sample of 1,083 disagreed that you would be grateful to a lifeguard or firefighter because it's their job to help. And therefore they were saving others in their line of duty. We were also able to test this assumption that people believe gratitude is warranted only when it's benevolently motivated. And we found that while these malicious and ulterior motives we operationalized undermined reported gratitude significantly, it didn't disqualify it. So 18.2% of respondents would feel grateful regardless of whether a benefactor had an ulterior motive of the sort we saw on the previous slide, and 12.4% reported that they'd be grateful for benefit which had even a malicious motive as well. So what does this lead me to say? Well, it leads me to say that there is potentially a reciprocal relationship between the views of the wise and the views of the many. The views of the many can influence the thinking of the wise. And a case in point here is that Robert Roberts, whom I mentioned earlier on, a 2004 citation, changed his understanding of gratitude in the light of our empirical research. In a 2015 paper, he reported that his interaction with the Jubilee Centre's work had substantially advanced his thinking, not only about the empirical study of gratitude, but also about its grammar. Kristján takes it that Roberts relaxed his earlier stance on supererogation, I mentioned a few minutes ago, because our data had showed that only 1 or 2% of people, young or old, subscribe to the view that a proper application of gratitude requires the benefactor to have gone beyond duty in creating this benefit for the beneficiary. So in other words, it's possible that some empirical evidence, empirical research would actually disconfirm some of the views of the wise, as was the case here. But of course, conversely, the views of the wise can profitably influence the many. Let's not forget the philosopher's objection that 1,000 lay people could all be wrong. Just because a lot of people believe something to be the case doesn't make it true. And it's also the case that lay people may need to finesse their understanding of concepts they hold. A lot of lay people confuse guilt and shame, or envy and jealousy. So there's a place, isn't there, for both the wisdom of the wise and the wisdom of the many, as Aristotle opined. So in order to examine how young people's understanding of the elements that influence gratitude operate, we manipulated those conceptual controversies in 4 specially written gratitude stories for primary school children. 270 school children from 6 schools in the UK participated, aged 8 to 11. And we replicated our study in Australia with 531 children there, aged 9 to 12, from 3 schools in Victoria. The children completed the story workbooks, which consisted of a mixture of kind of Likert scale responses, yes and no questions, and open-ended responses. So you can see an example there of what a page of that workbook looked like. So 2 of the stories featured nominations and covered similar content to the nomination vignette shown earlier. And similar to the vignettes, what we'd found there, of course, we'd used the vignettes with people over the age of 11, adolescents and adults. We found that ulterior motives didn't disqualify gratitude. So we found that in the children's stories as well. We also found in a pool party rescue recounted in one of the stories, the Blue Oasis, that young people didn't place a supererogation condition on gratitude either. Only 1 or 2 children indicated that they wouldn't be grateful to a lifeguard as she was just doing her job. So in terms of ulterior motives, what you see here is that 29% of the UK sample and 52% of that Australian sample thought a boy would be grateful for a nomination that was motivated by someone who wanted to copy his answers in a spelling test. And that was our means of operationalising the ulterior motive. We were interested to know how experiencing mixed emotions as well impacted on reported gratitude. And we found that 60% of the UK sample and 73% of the Australian sample said they thought a boy would be grateful for a nomination which elicited feelings of obligation, the sense that he should reciprocally nominate his nominator, even though he'd originally had someone else in mind. So mixed emotions coexist with feeling grateful. Now, since we had included open-ended questions as part of the workbooks, we were able to examine the reasons, this is very interesting, for the answers that young people gave on that previous slide. 70% of the UK respondents gave answers which showed that they understood the nomination was motivated by the ulterior motive of wanting to copy the other person's answers in a spelling test. In comparison with 46%, far fewer of the Australian children. Now this leads us to postulate really that in addition to kind of diagnosing some aspects of gratitude in young people, the stories could actually be used as teaching tools to explore gratitude and address comprehension of benefactors' motivations in young people. Because young people may fail to see non-benevolent intentions on the part of the benefactor, highlighting the importance of promoting discriminate gratitude. So while gratitude is widely, though perhaps not universally taken to be a virtue, teachers and educators, going back to what Kristján was saying, need to teach young people about the conceptual grammar of virtue, or of gratitude in this case, as well as the potential for gratitude to be used for self-serving or manipulative ends. So to this end, we published 2 papers on educating gratitude. And we've also published, you can see these 2 examples that we published in 2015. We also published another one that was looking at gratitude as an impression management strategy in ingratiation. So gratitude could actually have a shadow side. So gratitude needs to be discriminate and proportionate. So now the conclusion. It's a thoroughly Aristotelian conclusion that I come to. So in our work on gratitude, we examine gratitude through a thoroughly Aristotelian lens. The multi-component gratitude measure is the first measure to explore conceptual understandings of gratitude alongside emotions, attitudes, and behaviours. I walked you through that. It offers an assessment of the cognitive appraisals people make about gratitude. That gives us a sense of the underlying construal of what gratitude is as well. And it's been shown to be robust, and it offers a nuanced multi-componential understanding of gratitude, which enables these underlying conceptions of gratitude to be tapped. You don't get that in other measures, which take an understanding of gratitude as read. Second, in our work, we brought together expert and lay understandings. So we tried to marry the wisdom of the many with the wisdom of the wise. And along the way, we also brought the existing research on gratitude in philosophy and psychology into fruitful dialogue. So finally, let's park this in an educational context. So we recommend that gratitude be explored in a discriminating manner, which allows children to discern when gratitude is appropriate and fitting and an appropriate amount. And of course, this echoes Aristotle's concerns with mediality. So thank you very much for inviting me to present today. I think we go over to the next phase, and I'll stop sharing my screen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristján. Thank you, Liz, for 2 very insightful and very interesting talks. The papers and the slides will appear on the Jubilee Centre website tomorrow. I'd like to hand over now to our discussant for this webinar, Dan Wright. Dan is the head teacher at the London Oratory School, and where he has been head teacher for 3.5 years. Dan has previously held teaching posts at Gordon School and has held leadership posts at St George's College and Godalming College. Dan was the first Jubilee Centre Teaching Fellow from September to December 2014, and he is the lead author of the Jubilee Centre's secondary programme of study, which has been used by hundreds of schools nationally and internationally. Hand over now to Dan to give a response to those 2 papers. Dan.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you, Kristján, and thank you, Liz, for some incredibly thought-provoking and thoughtful papers. I guess my task in this is really to say, well, let's translate some of these ideas and interpret them on the ground in a school where perhaps not everybody is or yet knows that they are neo-Aristotelian, and perhaps not everybody is a Catholic. So as Aidan said, I'm obviously leading a Catholic school here in London, and I think the first thing to start with on these, what's the implications of these particular papers for a school? What are the practical implications? I think the first thing to say is that it's given us a language and a set of concepts with which we can work in order to understand ourselves and help pupils understand who they are. I can't recommend to you highly enough, actually, there's the book by Bob Roberts on the psychology of moral development. What I did with that book, with my classes, and I'm happy to share it with the Jubilee Centre, is I took down all of the emotions that he listed, so all the negative emotions and all the positive emotions, and how different kinds of virtues could educate and shape those particular emotions. And I use those in teaching, and we use those in teaching pupils about how to be virtuous. So it gives them the language and the concepts to understand what their virtues are. So for example, on some negative emotions, Bob categorizes in his book when our emotions tell us that we are taking offense, for example. So we've got anger, resentment, indignation, rage, frustration, annoyance, irritation, grievance, appeasement, all these sorts of things. And then he goes on to give definitions of what this actually means. So for example, we've got anger. You are to blame for offending me in the important matter of X, and by doing this or failing to do that, this is bad, and I'm in a position to condemn you. And so what's the countervailing virtue, if you like, or what is the virtue to which this emotion is inviting us to practice? Well, it's courage, it's patience, it's gentleness, it's kindness, it's fairness. And the great thing about emotions when you're dealing with children, and I deal predominantly with 11 to 18-year-olds, is that they are very real, and pupils have them, and they've felt very strongly. So it's a great way into talking about virtue and about how to practice and habituate oneself in virtue, which can be quite a removed and abstract conversation. So I'm happy to share that with the website. There's a whole series of negative emotions and a whole series of positive emotions, and I've just fractioned down those into some very short tables, which makes sense. So I think also when it comes to Catholic schooling, when we're talking about virtues, we have a tradition which is very well established and not without being contested, I understand that, but certainly is defensible, in the Cardinal Virtues. And as a Catholic school, we would put our focus particularly on the Cardinal Virtues of prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance. And I guess my question is I can't see any conflict between a neo-Aristotelian approach to emotions and a Thomist one. I guess we would speak more fully perhaps out of a Thomist tradition, but I wonder if there is any conflict that we're approaching virtues from a Thomist tradition, or certainly one tradition within Thomism. I wonder how well they would sit with a school, a Catholic school. I just question how well they would sit with a Catholic school looking at virtues. Now, I guess part of an answer to that for me, or thought, is that the emotions orient us towards the natural world and the world that is in front of us and the relations with others. But I would say the emotions also orient us towards God, towards the divine world, and that would be the life of grace, and how Catholic schools need to explore this life of grace and have a language for, if you like, the supernatural, not in a sort of Harry Potter kind of way, but in that which goes beyond nature. And so what role emotions play in that? And I think really interesting that Kristján talked about this question of awe. And I know Bob Roberts deals with this idea of transcendental emotions, and again, I've just done a summary on the kinds of things that he's been saying about those. And I think that's really an interesting way to stretch the Catholic imagination in Catholic schools, because what you would have is, for example, great literature, you could have great music, you have great art, which are material things, but they reach and point beyond them, and the awe draws you through them. Now, I don't know if that sounds too Platonic or not. I'm not well versed enough in philosophy, but this idea of the sacramentality of existence, of a life that's infused with grace, is something I think needs drawing out through great music, great literature, great art in Catholic schools. And I guess that would sit well with what it is we try to achieve through our curriculum as Catholics, which is this dimension of what we would call sapiential knowledge, that the knowledge that comes our way helps us to wrestle with the questions that our minds and our hearts are raising about meaning and about purpose and about existence and about God and so on and so forth. So I think it gives us all those kinds of that kind of language and those kinds of permissions to do that. So they're clear curriculum, both at the level of individual subject implications and more widely in how you approach the whole vocation of teaching and the mission of teaching. And with that, this idea of awe, I would say, we've got to provide opportunities for pupils to set their sights as high as is possible, because teenagers, young people are driven by this kind of idealism often, particularly around the issues of justice as they're getting older, and dignity of others and dignity of themselves, and that gives another potential platform or to explore how you shape good people and good Catholic children, I would guess. So that's on the academic side. That's quite philosophical. Another few takeaways from me on the pastoral side. One thing that really struck me was in Kristján's talk. Kristján was talking about the idea of that Aristotle sets out. That it's one of his slides. I can't remember which slide it was now, but there's a little tick box on this is covered by Aristotle. This is by care ethics. This is by other traditions of emotions, and this idea where behavior strategies are conditioning doesn't sit within virtue. It's a kind of pre-virtuous stage. That's really interesting because there are schools that have highly punitive, highly prescriptive, highly repressive behavior management strategies. And whether they're right for their context or not is not something I'm prepared to comment on. But it's really interesting that if you've got, there's been something in the press recently about enforced smiles and about highly prescriptive behavior strategies. Is that really virtue? And is this something that Catholic schools should be involved in? Now, I don't know if they are, but a question to myself is should not a behavior policy be appealing to the reason and the emotion of the children by setting out clear boundaries, and within those boundaries giving lots of freedom and appealing to the reason of the children? So I guess it's kind of it does raise the question about schools of character. Can we be schools of character if we do have highly systematized, highly mechanized, highly repressive and prescriptive behavior strategies? So that was a question that I kind of had for myself there. Obviously, there are clear spiritual implications in what's being said with the emotions, and I think as Catholics, we're not afraid of those kind of emotions. I think keeping prayer and sacrament at the centre of our schools is absolutely key. And what I like about this particular agenda is that the emotions are constitutive of the human person, that we embrace our emotions. They are part of who we are. We don't try to repress our emotions, I guess, like in a form of stoicism. We wouldn't necessarily try to just acquiesce and live with our emotions, like might be some traditions of mindfulness. And what's interesting is that language or anthropology that understands the importance of emotions sits very easily with what I would understand as a Catholic or Christian anthropology, whereas I'm a little bit more skeptical of things like mindfulness. I don't really know a great deal about that kind of practice, but I do sometimes wonder if it's not coming from a very different kind of set of anthropological assumptions. So my question is, should Catholic schools be involved in those kind of practices, or should we just go back to our own tradition, as it were, which is about prayer, about virtue, about sacrament, and those sorts of things? There are other issues as well, and I think again there's another interesting point there. I think that Kristján was alluding to this idea with the modern focus of on identities and this disconnect between who I perceive myself really to be and how the world perceives me to be. And that might be some of the driver, if you like, in some of the identity politics world, which again hits schools pretty hard. I mean, there are lots of organisations that are campaigning and advocating, and Catholic schools need to be aware of that. And they don't always necessarily sit comfortably with Catholic teaching on either superficial or even detailed analysis. But what we've got in this language of virtue and this language of emotion is we've got ways of tackling issues connected with PSHE and RSHE about online safety and about harassment and about, which is, temperance, and we've got a language that is very much rooted in the dignity of people as children of God, and I think that puts us on a firm footing to engage constructively with those issues, but engage with them from our own sort of set of concepts and language. So that's a real positive about this particular agenda. more broadly as well, as Liz was talking, I was thinking about, we all as leaders and as schools, we always want to have a culture of praise and thanksgiving and gratitude in our school that flows around. So it doesn't flow just from the leadership to the staff and to the pupils, the parents, and I guess my question is how we build that culture of gratitude that really does mark so many schools. One thinks of sort of structured ways in which gratitude can be expressed through parental contribution schemes and alumni associations and things like that. And so often it's people who come back 10 years, 15, 20 years after their school who realize what's been done for them. So gratitude has this kind of time distance from having received something that actually it takes you grow into admiring what it is you've received as you mature, and then want to give something back and make it because you realize the school has made a difference to you. And so I think it's important that we have those structures for that. And I think any talk about gratitude, of course, has to talk about the Eucharist. And again, this is gratitude going upwards. So we've got horizontal gratitude, which we would understand, and I understand the agenda of the Jubilee Centre is not religious. But as a Catholic school, we have this sense of vertical gratitude as well, which keeps the Mass, the Eucharist, I guess, which means thanksgiving, at the centre of school life. And so, I mean, as you know, I'm excited about the work of the centre and think it's a good thing. And I can see real practical implications in two or three particular ways. I think I can see the ways in which emotion and virtue is giving Catholic schools a language which sits well with our assumptions and our traditions, to give us a neutral territory to engage with the non-Catholic world and non-Catholic schools in a meaningful way, but also with the non-Catholics in our schools. I don't think you'll get any pushback from non-Catholics teaching in Catholic schools that emotions are real and the virtues, the habituation of the virtues is the best way of managing those emotions in order to thrive and to succeed. So those are my thoughts, a bit random as they are, but and I shall keep thinking about it. But thank you very much, and I'll hand over to the questioners now, to Aidan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for that response. I'd like to hand over to Jörg Schulte-Altedorneburg, Managing Director at Porticus in Germany, who will chair this Q&A. Thank you, Jörg, for posting the first question in the chat, and to Brian Jennings for also asking a question. If anybody else would like to ask one, then please do post a question in the chat.
Okay, thank you very much, Aidan. Oops. Yeah, thank you very much, Aidan. So I thought I was on mute still. I would propose to start with Brian Jennings' question to both presenters. Brian, if I may ask you to pose your question, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you. I am a theological educator located in Africa, and my interests have been going more and more towards adult education, especially in more teen contexts. And I've been growing in the awareness as I've acquainted myself with virtue ethics, that when we think about the learning and development of adults, we don't only need to think about the knowledge that they need for their tasks, nor the skills that they need for their tasks, but the character and virtues that they need for their tasks. And so I'm interested if there are any strategies that seek to apply virtue and emotional strategies of education to adult development. There seems to be a presumption in much of the literature that once you've graduated from university, your character is fixed forever and ever, amen. But I think the example of the apostles, Paul and Peter, show us the extreme falsehood of that assumption. Thank you.
Yeah, Jörg, maybe I can begin and hand over to Liz. So,
right.
it is often considered to be a problem or a weakness in Aristotelian theory that he's pretty much obsessed with moral education of very young people. This is often referred to as Aristotle's early childhood determinism. So he thinks that the foundations of all our virtues, including our virtuous emotions, are laid in childhood. He does believe that later in life we can hone these, we can sort of gradually improve them and sort of change them in various ways, but not radically so. He doesn't believe in Damascus experiences, for example, at all. So he would think that it would be virtually impossible, for example, to teach a nursing student who enters university at the age of 18 or 20 compassion and care if she didn't have these or he didn't have these emotional foundations already laid much earlier in life. Now, Aristotle may have been much too pessimistic about this. He does recommend, as I said, various ways in which we can sort of improve and reflect upon our virtues, and he talks particularly about the role of friends and the role of critical discussion with close friends in doing that, but it's always against the backdrop of these people having been brought up in relatively good habits. So definitely, I think most of us will know examples of people who were not brought up in good habits, but managed to sort of have radical moral conversions later in life. So definitely Aristotle was a bit too pessimistic about this. But like I said, I mean, his main focus on emotion education is at the early stages, and the later stages are just about sort of honing the the dispositions that are already there. So Liz, do you want to add something to this?
Well, not much, except to say that every day is a school day, isn't it? I mean, the fact that people are developing all the time and finessing what they think about these virtues shows a certain amount of change over development. I mean, even Bob Roberts, you know, had a view that, you know, gratitude, for example, requires this supererogation condition to be fulfilled, but then on reflection, sort of, and, you know, presented with obviously the kind of empirical evidence, changed his mind. But I think, you know, no man is an island, and when people interact with others and reflect with others, whether they're adults or children, a dialogical kind of understanding comes into play, and we might kind of refine our views of what true forgiveness is, or what true compassion is, or true gratitude for that matter. So I suppose all I would say is that it's kind of it's a life's work to understand the nuances of these virtues in the complexities of life. And of course, there are ways that you can consciously promote more reflective ways of thinking about gratitude or thinking about forgiveness. And I mean, in terms of forgiveness, you can actually have a sort of program of literature or films to actually kind of inspire adults to discuss the complexities of the concepts. But I would start out with a kind of reflective turn, I think, towards how we actually understand the virtues with adults, which often expands behind, you know, the prior understandings that people had. Forgive and forget, when you sort of start to drill down on that, you realize it's a bit more complex. Obviously, there are lots of, you know, ways you can actually get adults to reflect on these virtues, and tangible kind of exercises, gratitude journals. For example, you can get people to keep a journal for a period of a few weeks and to call to mind the benefactors in a sort of, you know, focused way. So I think really, I wouldn't want to be as deterministic as Aristotle about it, but I think, you know, I would say that the first step is really trying to distill the meaning of these terms and to start a discussion about what they are with adults. That's what I would try to do if I were at the helm of an adult education group.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Christian. We have another question coming from Father Jared Heaslip to Christian. Father Jared, would you please ask your question.
Yes, the question is, very often we find sort of conflict between what our emotions would impulse us to do and what our logic tells us what we should do in order to live up to a virtue. So sometimes apparently emotions and rationale are in conflict instead of being in harmony. How does Aristotle manage this, or does he recognize this conflict?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And this basically sets Aristotle apart very much from many other modern philosophers like Kant. So Aristotle talks a lot about conflict between reason and emotion, but he talks about it only in the case of people at the lower levels of moral development, especially the people he calls continent or incontinent, or sort of having or lacking self-control. So the standard example would be somebody who is sort of very greedy for food, and he's got a full box of chocolates, and there is a conflict between sort of his desires, his emotion to eat all this chocolate, and his reason, which tells him that he shouldn't. So Aristotle is very aware of these problems and talks about them a lot. And then for somebody like Kant, this is basically the core of moral conflict for everyone. I mean, for Kant, the core of moral conflict is always this conflict between emotion and reason. And Kant even thinks that the collaboration of an emotion compromises the moral worth of a choice. So it's better to act against emotion. For example, when you give money to a beggar, if you do it out of sympathy and kindness of heart, then it doesn't have the same moral value as if you really hate the beggar and find him disgusting, but you give him money anyway. But for Aristotle, when you reach the highest level of moral development, when you become a phronimos, then you cannot really talk about moral conflict anymore as a conflict between reason and emotion, because all the emotions of the phronimos are infused with reason. Does it mean that we don't have any conflicts anymore? No, we still have conflicts, but they are not conflicts between reason and emotion. They are conflicts between two different virtues, which are both infused with emotion, but which cannot both be activated in the same context. So we get the standard example of honesty and loyalty, for example, being in conflict, but they're both infused with very strong and positive, morally positive emotions. It's good, and it's in general to be honest, it's good to be loyal to your friends, but sometimes there's a conflict. So this is the reason why the conflicts that Aristotle talks about are conflicts between these sort of two thick virtues, both inspired by emotions, and where we need phronesis, this practical wisdom, this sort of meta virtue to make the decision. Whereas for Kant, this would just continue to be the same kind of conflict that you see with morally less developed people, namely between reason and emotion, and where the goal is to police, to control or manage the emotions. Whereas for Aristotle, you're not supposed to police or manage your emotions. You're supposed to make them sort of, cooperate with you to become, as he says, reason infused. So, and this is why for Aristotle, not having the right emotions in the right circumstances is itself a symbol of moral failings. So this is the unique Aristotelian picture of this reason emotion conflict. I see Liz wants to add something to this.
I really do. I must protest because, and I think I'm kind of linking something that Dan said as well to do with whether there's any conflict. And basically, I think there is a conflict anthropologically between, what Aristotle takes the human person to be and a Christian view in terms of, humanity being divided against itself. Because there's that, I don't know whether Father Gerard had this in mind, but obviously there's that quotation from Romans 7:15. I do not understand what I do, what I want to do. I'm doing the very thing I hate. You all know the citation I'm talking about. That humanity, the human person, is divided against themselves. Aristotle basically isn't taking that view. It's like if everything's in alignment, nobody would be nobody would do the wrong action because they'd have the right emotions, they'd be educated, they'd have educated their emotions to behave in the right way. And so it's really more of a kind of a comment, I suppose, linking what Dan said to what Father Gerard's just said as well, which is that there perhaps is a kind of a conflict somewhere on the level of the anthropology that's presupposed by these different views of the human person. I mean, are we really, are we up to it, Christian? Are we up to doing this, or are we fallible and sometimes do the very thing that we don't want to do? So I think we are.
Yeah, well, I was basically just answering the question, which was a question about Aristotle's view. I wasn't endorsing Aristotle's view. I mean, I think Aristotle's view is sometimes a bit too rosy and unrealistic.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't having a go, obviously, in that sense. It's just that it linked to something I felt that Dan had said, because this is obviously a religious dialogue to be had as well. As I say, I think this kind of question of what we think the human person is rather fundamental to what we think we're capable of doing, and whether we actually think we're basically in some measure estranged from our better natures.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, Aristotle doesn't really have any conceptual arsenal at his disposal to explain what happens in the case of Sophie after Sophie chooses the boy over the girl in the concentration camp. If it is a right decision, then for Aristotle, she shouldn't feel any pain. I mean, she should be completely unified. She has taken the right decision, etc. Whereas we all know that even after the best decisions taken by the best people, they may feel this, what I would call sort of post-phronetic pain. So just to repeat, I mean, I'm not endorsing Aristotle's psychology fully. I think it is sometimes too rosy, especially the way he describes the fully developed people. But at least it is very different from the Kantian view of this constant sort of war waged between reason and emotion.
Thank you very much. And this is paving the way to the final question I posed on the chat to Christian, because in the light of your answer, one could ask why you wouldn't classify Aristotle as a hard rationalist. Because if we take a look at the catalogue of emotions in the Rhetorics, for example, then of course every emotion is described as a highly complex process of perception and the connection of different perceptions resulting in a striving, in a highly rational striving, but all of this is happening in an unconscious way. So for personally me, it might be appropriate to call him an intellectualist. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, he's an intellectualist. He's obviously a rationalist. Is he a hard or a soft rationalist? Well, that's a kind of a definitional sort of philosophical gameplay, but I mean, in the standard literature in philosophy, a hard rationalist would be somebody who believes that moral facts exist independently of emotion, and believes as well that emotions hinder rather than help our quest for these moral facts. So that would be the Kantian position. Whereas for Aristotle, yes, emotions do exist independently of, moral facts do exist independently of emotions, but emotions help us in our quest for these moral facts. So that in that sense, he is a soft rationalist. And also this claim he makes that it's not enough for us to be morally worthy. We, in order to lead a good life, to lead a flourishing life, we also need to think of ourselves as being morally worthy. So he thinks that the attitudes or the emotions we harbor towards ourselves are constitutive of our well-being, which is a very, very modern view. It's a sort of, as I said, many hundreds of years before identity politics, and obviously it doesn't go as crazily far in the direction of identity politics as people do nowadays. But he does think that, as I said, the mirror is also part of the furniture that it mirrors. So it's not just enough to have all the moral facts there and then just to use the mirror to sort of mirror them or reflect them. The mirror itself also needs to be up to scratch.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. Are there any other questions? Now is the time. Last call. everyone's satisfied. Very good results.
Jörg,
So
can you say one thing? I mean, obviously Liz was too modest to mention this, but for those of the people in the audience who are interested in emotion education, especially at the younger stages, Liz, in addition to being a wonderful scholar, has also written great children's books about emotions and virtues, and that you can buy on Amazon, and some of them I would strongly recommend, because they are very, very unusual from anything else you can get as teaching material for young kids regarding emotion education.
Thank you for the shout out.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm also impressed as a parent. So if there aren't any other questions, I would like to hand back to Aidan.
Thanks, Jörg. Well, that draws us pretty much to a conclusion today. And thank you very much to our speakers, to Professor Kristján Kristjánsson, to Dr. Liz Gulliford, and to Dan Wright, for your very interesting and illuminating presentations on Aristotle and virtuous emotions. Thank you very much to Jörg for chairing the Q&A, and thank you very much to you for joining us, for participating, and for being a part making this webinar happen. The papers, the slides, and this recording of the webinar will appear online on the Jubilee Centre website tomorrow, certainly by lunchtime tomorrow. If you wish to access it, or if you wish to register for any of the forthcoming webinars, which we're taking a little break during the summer, will resume in September, then please do. It's jubileecentre.ac.uk/virtues, and that should take you directly to the registration page for the future ones, and you'll also be able to view the papers from this webinar and from the previous one that was held last month. Thank you to everybody once more, and we have finished ahead of time. So well done to everybody for that. But wishing you a very pleasant afternoon and evening, or whatever time of day it is where you join us from, and we look forward to welcoming you to another Jubilee Centre event in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.